So I just want to say welcome to everyone joining us today for our Fall Campus Day. It is my pleasure to speak with you today. My name is Dr. Rhonda McEwen. I am the director of the Institute of Communication, Culture, Information, and Technology. And I believe that's why you're here to learn a bit more about ICCIT. So there were many people who would have met me on, let's say, Ontario University Fair. That was in the old days. So in this new environment, we are now online, but that still gives me the opportunity to actually do a land acknowledgement. So before we get started, I want to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto, Mississauga operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Senecas, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Since the land that we learn and work and research and normally meet on is that land, it's important to acknowledge it. Growing up in the Caribbean, I learned the names of the Caribs and the Arawaks, but I never had the opportunity to learn the Canadian First Nations. And as an immigrant to Canada, I take this opportunity to recognize the land and also the struggle that the Indigenous peoples have and continue to go through as they find their way to self-determination. And I commit myself in this small way to human rights work around the world. And wherever you are listening in today on our Fall Campus Day, I give you that ability to recognize the land that you are on. We're going to get started. I'm going to do a mini lecture for you. And what I chose to do was think about what might be interesting that I'm doing that you might want to know a bit more about. So I invite you to listen to this mini lecture. It will take about just around half an hour. And then if you have questions, please do. I believe you can put them in on FeedLoop, and I will answer those questions when I'm finished the presentation. I can also answer not just questions about the presentation, but about ICCIT in general, things that you may want to know as you think about where you'd like to spend your undergraduate time. And I truly hope to see you in my classes. I teach 2 classes as the director of the Institute. I teach the second year class, 202, CCT 202, which is called Human Machine Communication. And I'm going to talk a little bit about human machine communication today. And the second course I teach is Introduction to IT Consulting. And that's a 3rd and 4th year course. So if you're in your upper year as a senior undergraduate, you would take that course. And in that course, you have the opportunity to work as a consultant in a consulting group that you create. You've created a little company and you work on a live project for real clients. So that gives you something amazing to put on your resume as you go out. So I'm going to start and I'm going to take a minute to share my screen with you. And really, I look forward to hearing all your amazing questions as we get going. So let's get to this slideshow. So what I want to talk to you about today is digital technologies in general. So digital technologies are all that we talk about at ICCIT. It actually is a core of what we do. And I want to share this project. It is actually called Digital Technologies, Chinese Interpersonal Communication on the Mainland and in the Diaspora, the Case of COVID-19. And this project, I work with our senior undergrads. Oops, I think I just lost my share screen for a second. I'm just going to share it again for you. So I'm working with some of our amazing students, and one of them is Xiao Zhao. Xiao is a postdoctoral fellow who works with me and is part of the Knowledge Media Design Institute Semaphore Labs. I have a lab, a digital lab there. And then I have my doctoral student, Yasi Zhao, who's been working with me for 2 years. She's in her 2nd year of her doctoral studies at the Faculty of Information, which is also at University of Toronto. And we have another faculty member, Tony Tang, who is working as well on this project. And I like to think about this project as in a way, we're making lemonade. And if any of you are actually know this expression, You take lemons and you make lemonade. And so this is what we're doing in this project. So I'm just going to try to get to the next slide. I don't know what's happening with my slide progression. There we go. So why am I calling it making lemonade? You know the expression, when life gives you a lemon, you make some lemonade. Well, it's because we started this project to work on robots. So as I explained to you, my research right now is on human machine communication. So I look a lot at human robot interactions. I look at the way in which people are coming into close connections with robots for the first time. And some robots you're not thinking about. Not all robots have an articulated hand like the one in this picture. Some robots are as simple as the voice assistants. If any of you have Alexa, or if you use Siri or Google Home, these are known as voice assistants. And they are using AI technologies to drive their interactions with human beings. So they're a disembodied robot, but they take on many of the same kind of philosophies of robotics. So what we had planned to do was a project with a Now robot, which is a very cool robot. If you haven't seen it, you should look it up. It's NAO robot. And we wanted to look at trust. How do people interact with machines, and how does trust develop over time? Do we trust a robot with answers to questions instead of another human being? So we were going to do these interesting experiments in the lab with strangers that were people and robots and participants. And of course, here came COVID-19. So we put our robot project on the shelf for a minute. It's coming back for sure. But we decided not to wait, but to try a different project. So instead of working on the human robot trust project, we decided to look at context-aware computing, think about how technologies have integrated within the pandemic process, and look at China and compare what was happening in China, since they had gone further along as the pandemic began in the East and percolated to the West, and see what lessons could be learned, and look to how technologies were being used in the two countries, China and Canada, and see if there were any comparisons that we could make. So the area that I'm talking about here is really around context-aware computing. And I wanted to talk about this sort of theoretical history, how we got to the point of thinking about humans and robots and machines in the context of the pandemic, but thinking about where did we get these ideas of AI from? So context awareness is a property that really began with mobile devices, and it defines a way to think about location awareness. I'll give you a good quick example of this. Way back when I was in engineering, it was a big feat to figure out how do you go from your phone in your house, your cell phone in your house, if on a call, and when you walk outside of your Wi-Fi, can you switch automatically into the wide area telecommunications cellular network without dropping the call? And we used to call that handover. We're handing over the Wi-Fi system into the wide area telecommunication system. But to be able to do that, that means that your phone would have to be aware that you had switched contexts or locations. So context awareness really began way back in mobile computing, and it describes that situation where a wearable or mobile computer is aware of the user's state and surroundings, and it would be able to change its behavior based on that information. And we use this as designers of technology as we think about what are the ways in which our technologies need to adapt to a new situation. So if you think about it very quickly, some of the very simple apps you have on your phone are able to do context awareness right now. For example, if you're using Google Maps, it will know that sometimes if you turn out of your street and you start heading in a particular direction, that you typically go that way at certain times of day and on certain dates. And so it makes adjustments based on your movement and where you are. It might give you traffic information. It might be integrated with your car to know that where the next gas stations might be. It might know when you're heading off to Costco or your favorite coffee shop and give you some kind of traffic or navigation information. So this is exactly what we talk about. So in terms of designing systems, especially wearables, and a lot of my research is in the area of wearables, we can think about personal preferences and see how the machine or the AI or the robot can learn about where we go and the context of where we're in. So what does this have to do with COVID-19? Well, as you know, one of the biggest things that is important in managing and the fight against COVID-19 is, let's see if we remember, contact tracing, right? The ability to know when people have been proximate with each other and to understand from that context awareness when certain information needs to flow to health authorities or to your apps or whatever. So this is where we're starting to think about these sorts of things. Conceptually, there are things that guide the way that we're doing the project. One of them is work by Lucy Suchman, who is I had the pleasure of meeting when I was doing my doctoral studies. She's a professor in the UK. And in her books on human-machine interaction, she says this lovely sentence, as part of a sentence. She said, human cognition, or the way that humans think and the way that we make sense and perceive the world, is situated in the social and in the physical context. And we, people, use our cognitive representation of a situation in acting and interacting. What does that all mean? What Professor Suchman here is saying is that the way that we make sense of the world, the way that we understand what's around us in our own context, has as much to do with the physical as it has to do with the social. And that we make a representation, we create a way of thinking about the world because of interacting and thinking that way. Basically, that's how human AI works. It's not the A, it's the actual human eye, human intelligence, or human sense making. So Hoffman and Woods give us the alternate. They say machines do not know that they are in the world that they have within themselves as a model of the world. Okay, really complicated sentence. But Hoffman and Woods, they're basically saying opposite to the human intelligence, the way humans perceive and think about the world. As developers create algorithms, they actually create for machines a perspective of what the world is. So the machine doesn't do that on its own. It's already been coded, and that is what drives the machine. So in a way, a machine has a world in its being that has already been decided and designed. So the hardest part of AI then is reconciling that major difference between humans and machines, that humans are able to make these representations and change representations of the world based on their cognition, yet machines are already embedded with a certain idea of the world from the get-go. It's built within them, designed for them, and they have to figure out how they operate within that space, which then makes the machine a much more difficult entity to consider in terms of artificial or intelligence coming together. The last influence, I'm very influenced by systems theory or systems thinking, which says that we must not just think about interaction as in the micro, in the small scale. I said this to you, you said this to me, but we must think about the bigger system within which interaction happens. So in the case of COVID-19, I don't just think about how are we using our devices at home. I think about how are the devices we use at home connected into the broader ability for us as human beings to manage within the scale of a global pandemic. So just to connect these things for you, context awareness, trust, and communicating with machines. That was my original thought, my first project that I put on the shelf, but it's coming back. I have this interest in the consequences of context ambivalence, and context ambivalence really means the inability to really know the changing context deeply. So a machine Google might know that you're headed in the direction of work at 9 a.m. on a Wednesday, but it may not know that you're actually going to visit a relative who's not well at the moment, who happens to be going in the same initial direction. So they wouldn't really have that depth of knowledge. So in a way, the context awareness that the machine has, they're ambivalent to the actual changes that may come. And finally, I'm really interested in this idea that we're now calling contextual artificial intelligence, which is trying to build toward artificial intelligence that is able to flex and move and to be more context aware. And that's the goal. So in May of 2020, I applied for a COVID-19 grant, which is funding for research. And what I was successful with my team in getting it. We have 3 themes on our research project. We're looking at children and technology. We're looking at the health code, and I'll explain that in a second. And we're looking at online education and how these technologies are operating within the context of the pandemic. So if we think about I just talked about context awareness. Now I'm going to take that theory and show you how I'm applying it. If we think about the macro context of the COVID-19 pandemic, a global, worldwide outbreak of a viral infection, we can think then, how do we situate digital technologies? So one of the questions we ask in the research is, how did technology impact people's daily life during the outbreak of the 2019 novel coronavirus, starting by looking at China? We wanted to understand how were people using digital technologies to keep connected, updated, and safe. And we chose China as a case study to look at how people use technologies during the pandemic, since they experienced much of the effects first. Also in urban China, it's a very kind of technology heavy environment, which would be a fantastic way to look at this. And also to see if there were lessons that we could learn from east to west. Another question we were interested in is, were the experiences universally similar, or are there differential effects of staying sheltered at home and moving inside and online? So for example, did the pandemic affect older people differently from younger people? Well, healthier people versus those who are medically challenged, or affluence over poverty. So we were interested in seeing whether people were having different kinds of experiences of the pandemic. And finally, we were interested in this question: what are the communication and media use lessons learned by those first affected by the pandemic? We have done so far about 95 interviews. Sorry, 95, yeah. Since I did this slide, it's about 95. Most of them, about 85 now, have been done all in Mandarin, and the rest in English. We're doing a thematic analysis. So from the data, we're looking to see what themes are rising based on the questions we've asked. And then we're doing some follow-up interviews, which is why we have more than on what's on this slide, on interesting themes that arise. Some of the questions we were asking was, how do people get information during the pandemic? How did they decide what information is useful and what is worth sharing? How are people using technologies and for what reasons, etc.? So our first theme that came up was children and technology. So we are thinking here about a micro context change. So I talked about context awareness of what's happening in the lived environment. But here's a small one: from the classroom to the home. How did children use different technologies during the pandemic? What we found right away is that 2 technologies came to the fore, looking at China and looking at children. The first was the children's smartwatch market, a massive market in Asia, and in particularly in China. So we have written 1 paper already about this, and we have submitted that for review. So that should be coming out for presentation, but I'll give you a sneak peek because you decided to come to this presentation. The second theme that arose looking at children and technology was children's AI robots. And although I talked about the Now robot that we were going to use, we found that a lot of children were using a robot called Luca. Perhaps you know it, perhaps you don't. But Luca is an education robot that helps reading. So it reads with children and does quite a lot of literacy. And that paper is currently in progress. We should be finished that by November 1st. We noticed that children were relying heavily on smartphones, and particularly, so it's not smartphones, smart watches. The thing about China is that most children between the ages of 4 and 13 don't own a smartphone. And there are some regulatory and government guidelines around having young children use mobile phones. And so instead, what has become much more popular is that children have smartwatches. And here in this very sweet image, we see two children, and the girl is actually taking a selfie with her friend. So we now know that from our data that we've collected, more than 85% of children in urban areas in China own at least one of these smartwatches. So it's very popular. The price has dropped quite significantly in terms of development so that it is quite accessible to people. It's quite fancy. They have lots of features, and I'll share some of those with you. Here in this very busy slide, I do have some things to point out. One of the things I could do is show you here. I'm going to just use this laser pointer quickly. Here are some of the features. There's a fitness game, radio, there are actual fun games that you can play. There's social, so you can actually chat and do video chat. You have it's a camera, it's got a dictionary, near field communication, etc. And then you also have things like a geofence, and a geofence is actually a bounded area, and you would get a buzz if you stepped outside of that area. So you have a geofence that a parent could set. The parent could also do remote monitoring from another device once a child has the watch on. There's also GPS. There are also media players like video, so watching the equivalent of YouTube, for example. It's a phone. It's got Bluetooth. You can run payments. It can be used as a payment tap. And then it has this classroom mode. And what classroom mode does is once you toggled to off, and the parent could do it remotely, it switches all the other features off and they become inaccessible, and only like basic, it turns more like in a basic watch or calculator. So the project, what we've started doing is calling this system a dual user. So we're saying that basically there are two users of this system. We usually think of things like wearables as being owned by an individual. But in this case, we're saying that there are actually two users. There is the child who's the user, and then there is the parent. And the parent as the user is interested in certain features, and the children with other features. And so we wanted to understand, how did COVID-19 affect how smartwatches were being used by children and their parents? So we did these 36 parent-child interviews. So first interviewing the parent, then the child, or vice versa. And we talked about their perceived importance of certain features. We did something we call a Kano model, which is a way of understanding customer satisfaction with a product. And I love talking about these kinds of models because when I teach my students about it, they can actually take that into the workplace with them when they graduate. Knowing how the Kano model works is an amazing tool for marketing, for example. And then we wanted to compare before and during the pandemic and see if there were any differences. So here's an example of what you would see from a Kano model. This is the Kano parents side, this is the children's side, and this is a little change in comparing the parents and the children. So just very quickly, using visual information, you can see two very different representations of the same technology during and after, before and during the pandemic. We can see that parents like certain kinds of features, children like sometimes the same, but sometimes quite different features. And then we wanted to understand that a little closer. So we talk about what changed during COVID-19. On the left of the screen, we see that the parents, we can see from this graph, the blue or the sort of aqua color are increased preference during COVID-19, and yellow is decreased preference during COVID-19. Same on the other side is for children. So you can see, for example, as a quick one, here, the fitness game increased preference during COVID-19 among parents compared to it being before the pandemic. And then we can see here that parents really didn't like the media player, right? Once the pandemic started, they were like, that media player is getting too much use. And we can see the children had a slightly different profile. And what we were interested in here is really troubling the idea that a lot of device manufacturers think about these devices as belonging to a single user, right? This is the children's smartwatch. But in fact, it actually belongs to two users, this child and the parent. And if you go into designing this technology with that in mind, you would probably have made different decisions. Context awareness comes in here as well, because in the classroom, or when the child is, if we think about the pandemic, the child is no longer able to go into a classroom. The ability of control that the parents had over what the children could access very much changed because of the context of the pandemic when everyone was at home. So controlling access became very contentious and difficult. And we heard a lot of battles between parents and their children emerging. Because for the first time, the children realized that that controlling access wasn't limited to just a classroom, but could be spreading into other areas of their lives that they hadn't really noticed before the pandemic. We also considered in a lot of detail what were the features that were most relevant during the pandemic. And for children, they wanted to communicate, being separated from their friends and their classrooms. They wanted to stay in touch. The parental monitoring went right out the window. There was no need for that feature. And smartwatch as an entertainment product became its main purpose, to keep children occupied. So if you step back a second, I started talking about context awareness and artificial intelligence. Is there a way for the smartwatch, to know that it's now in a pandemic scenario, and it could automatically start switching out some of those features instead of it being manually driven by a parent? So reducing some of the effects and the clashes and the tensions. That's an interesting design idea, right? Could we create context awareness that would not just respond to location, but could respond to more general context changes? Another theme we looked at very quickly, and I won't stay long in this because I want to hear from you, is the second theme that emerged around the health code. If you're not sure what health code is about, in the New York Times, they produced in around August, they published a piece, and it was called In Coronavirus Fight, China Gives Citizens a Color Code with Red Flags. And it was a pretty critical argument. But the health code in China basically is an implementation of on WeChat of using an Alipay platform. So it would be the equivalent of using Instagram and overlaying Instagram with another application that would basically indicate whether or not you were healthy enough to be let into public spaces. And here on this slide, I have a few examples. A green code, it looks like a green QR code, allows people to get access into public spaces, for example, into buses or into malls. So here you see an inspector scanning someone to enter or exit a public space. It is basically a contact tracing app that talks about whether people have low, medium, or high exposure, depending on the color. The people with green codes are allowed into public spaces. If your code is yellow, it means that you must self-quarantine for 14 days. And red means that you need to quarantine in a centralized location identified by your government. And what users need to do is record their temperature daily and put it into the app to keep the code green. If you decide you don't feel like participating, then your code does not go into green, which means you no longer have access to public spaces. So this app is also linked to your ID, your formal government ID, your phone number, all the location data on your phone, etc. In terms of how it's architected, in terms of a systems architecture, we know that the health code app, here it is, it connects right into the provincial health code data and health information database that is held and managed by the government. The scanning systems, like what they were using in the malls to let people in or out, or set systems on the buses, then tap right into the national ID verification platforms so that they know exactly who you are, where you live. And this information, if you come into contact with someone who has COVID-19, it would automatically push that notification through to the app that would tell you what you need to do, but also stop you from going into public spaces. So in our initial findings, we started noticing a few things that in our interviews with Chinese people who had, it's mandatory, you don't have a choice with the health code app, it is mandatory. They started thinking about it as collectively caring for each other. So it wasn't this idea of Big Brother or this idea of, WeChat and Alipay taking my data. It was, how do we stay safe and how do we keep the members of our families and our communities safe? They will really have a different idea about privacy versus safety. We then started to compare the health code system to the COVID alert app. I don't know how many of you have it. I have it downloaded on my phone. And just today, I saw in CBC has run a piece about the fact that 5% of Ontarians have downloaded the app and are using it, 5%. This is compared to a mandatory app in China where it's almost 100% of usage. So very different perspectives on contact tracing and the use of technologies to control access. We know that the level of enforcement is very different with these two systems. The concepts around these two systems are very different. And so that's why we started to interview people in Ontario. So we added 16 participants so far, both from the Chinese community, because they would know a lot more about the health code app back in China. A lot of their family would be using it. And then 8 just local Canadians around the place to get us just to understand people's conceptualization. Again, that idea of cognition, right? Our cognitive, the representation we have about the virus and how technologies play a part. So we are looking at the motivation, the expectations, and the experience, and the potential improvement for using something like these apps, and looking at how we are architecting it in Canada and in Ontario with the COVID alert app, and comparing it to how it's being used in China. On the COVID alert side, it's a Bluetooth-based application, so it would tell if you came into contact, but we are not required to use it. It's not mandatory. It does not link to the government databases in the same way. It certainly does not require us to take an action daily, and it doesn't stop our access into public spaces. So very different. So what I find fascinating is here we have the same purpose of the technology to do contact tracing, but 2 different approaches on how to implement that. And, we were talking to some people in China who were saying, there were ways that they wish they could even game the system. And people in Ontario said the same thing. So I guess humans are the same everywhere. But we are certainly learning some things that we would like to share with the government as we think through how we might do something differently with the COVID alert app. And also, are there things from the way we are implementing contact tracing that could be useful for people in China as they think through what their system has been? So to do some comparisons. Finally, and I won't take too long in this one, we've been looking at online education. In China, they made the decision that the elementary school children would remain at home and the high schoolers would be in school in person. So they took the flip that we are seeing here in Ontario, where our elementary kids are in school every day and our high school children are in a hybrid mode. And so we are starting to look at how university professors in China are finding the experience with their students, especially as some universities have gone into this hybrid mode or are fully online only. So far, we're hearing reports that students are more engaged, that there's higher attendance online. Anecdotally, we are seeing the same thing in the West. But what we want to understand is what sits behind that, right? 70% of China-based university students reported they preferred remote education. And we're going to try and find out what's happening on our end. I've already run some statistics for ICCIT, and we're seeing similar things. Everyone misses being with each other in person, for sure. No one denies that. But somehow the remote instruction is working quite well, and a lot of that has to do with the asynchronous access to content. But we want to do some additional queries. Why? Are there cultural issues? Is it around the education systems? And if there are so many differences in our systems, then what accounts for the similarities in what's happening? And finally, are there changes in the way that we are even thinking about education? And are these going to be lasting changes as we move into this sort of new world? So we are doing follow-up surveys and interviews that's currently in progress to look at the motivation, the engagement, and any different factors that account for differences in our online education systems. So I just want to wrap up so we get time to talk. I started by saying that this was a talk discussing about making lemonade. So taking what hasn't been a great situation and making the best of it. And in fact, what we're finding is that these lemons are quite tasty, right? We're getting some really good data, some really cool insights that we would not have if it had not been for the pandemic. So it's letting me rethink ideas around context, context awareness, and representations. It kind of reminds me of ubiquitous computing, which is what we used to call context awareness, this idea that computing is everywhere around us. And it's become part of our daily lives in ways that we cannot account. We certainly see that during the pandemic. CARIL actually stands for Context Augmented Robotic Interaction Layer. And it's a human robot interaction system that talks about how do we get to context aware artificial intelligence, where our machines and our robots and our apps start understanding a bit more and maybe start seeing the world more like a human would. So that is my idea here, is that ubiquitous computing from the days of many decades ago is finally catching up with these ideas of context awareness in robotics. And so this project is just a drop in that bucket. So I want to say thank you for your attention. That's just a little snapshot of what a lecture can be like at ICCIT. It's not, we all have different topics, but I wanted to share that research with you. So I can stop sharing and we could start doing some questions. So we can start, if anyone has questions, please do put it into the system, and I'm happy to answer questions, not just on the topic that we just went through, but anything you'd like to know about ICCIT, life as an ICCIT student. As the director, I can give you really great perspective about other courses. So I open the floor to you to hear if you have any questions for me. Okay, so far we're quiet. Or maybe people are typing. It's gonna give people a little bit more time. Am I supposed to suspect by the quiet that everything was so clear? Oh, and you have no questions to ask. Oh, Marissa, I see Marissa coming on to support. You just, yes, you're still muted. Let me see if I can unmute you. All right. This is the power of the technology right here. Let's see if I'm fancy. Okay, let me do a different thing.
Oh, there we go. Sorry, I think I was inadvertently muted there. But there is a question from Ellie. If technology were to keep advancing to be more context aware, wouldn't it sooner or later cross a boundary about privacy? I'm going to stop my video, but I'm going to keep the volume on.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Marissa.
That's a great question.
That's an amazing question. You're already an ICCIT student, I can see. So the idea of privacy is one that we really are looking into even in this current project, right? This idea of if our apps are basically taking all our information. The health code app from China is even sending information to the police so that they can enforce contact tracing even at another level. And what we are getting to the point at, so there are two things. One, in all of my research on mobile media, we know that people see privacy almost like a transactional token. So it's almost like money, right? Am I willing to give up a bit of my privacy to get access to certain kinds of technology? So if any of you use social media, we certainly have given up a little bit of our privacy to participate in those networks. Another example would be if you ever use anything Google, you know that there are algorithms in the background learning about what your preferences are and your tastes and your search histories to try and craft advertising for you. We've already seen that we're using our privacy almost like a something we're willing to give up in order to get something back. So I call that, it's like transactional. So that's certainly one way we've already gone down that path. And unless you're living somewhere under a rock, I think there's some level in which your information is even known by the systems, right? So if you have a mobile phone, you know that your information, you at any time the cell towers know where you are. So let's put that into the context of robotics now. As robots become more and more context aware, absolutely we lose something on privacy. And what we're finding in the research I just shared with you is that people are thinking about privacy and security and safety in different ways. So privacy doesn't mean security, and neither does that mean safety. So people are saying, well, if the health code keeps me safe, I'm willing to give up all of my privacy. That's in China. Here in the COVID alert app, not so much. And that's a cultural factor, I believe, as well. But there is this idea that the robots, if you have Alexa in your house or Google Home, they are listening almost continuously for you to say either Alexa or okay, Google. I have my phone right here. If I say it, it wakes up my phone and it listens. But this idea of the constantly listening machine, right? And that's already happening. So is it that we are starting to change our ideas about privacy anyway? That's the kind of thing we talk about. Great question.
Thank you for that. One of the pieces that I find really interesting about your program or this program, and I'm going to anticipate that many of our guests today are perhaps in grade 11 or grade 12, starting to think about what life might look like after high school. Some of you might already be in college or university, or you've stepped away from higher education looking to come back. One of the things that I find really fascinating about this program, or really refreshing, is the opportunity to dabble with a number of different areas, and that you don't have to have it all figured out at this point. And I'm just wondering if maybe you can speak to that a little bit further, especially as students are starting to do some of their research, and I know feeling maybe a little bit stressed that they have to get the program right when they're submitting their application. Maybe if you can talk about some of the flexibility that's available in your in this field.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, so we have scholars. I'll tell you where some of our faculty come from. We have faculty members who come from the humanities, so people who have spent their life examining, for example, books and material cultures like artifacts, right? So people who are really interested in that. We have faculty members who are artists, right, who engage in visual communication and really interested in things like graffiti and how things port online and thinking about interfaces, design. We have design faculties who are think about what I'm talking about and translate that into how do we design these interfaces better and for various different kinds of users. And then we have people who are cultural theorists, people who think about culture and race, for example, and other kinds of diversity as we engage. We all in this community at ICCIT, we all think about technology, but we come at it from different perspectives. We have people from computer science. I have a background in engineering. And then we have people who think about it in terms of linguistics and writing, right? How do we write for this new world that we're in? So that's our professional writing and communication program, which is one of our secret sauces. It's just a phenomenal program. Whether you think you're amazing later or not, we can make you amazing. And I think these are some of the features of our program. If you're more interested in thinking about things from a social media platform side, we have that perspective. If you're interested in being a critic of these technologies, we have people who are doing that. And if you have people who want to design for these technologies, definitely you'll find a home. So our program is very flexible. We have three three programs at the moment that you can take and focus your area. We have our digital enterprise management program focuses on the use of technologies for business and entrepreneurial endeavors. So these are all things you can be engaged in at ICCIT. So even if you're not decided, we welcome you to come on in.
Thank you for that. And I know for some of the parents that might be joining us as well, Rhonda, I think you've done an excellent job at showing the relevancy of the types of projects that students are involved in. And I often know that that's a question we often receive from parents or guardians or teachers. What am I going to do with this education in the world? And I think that you've provided some really dynamic and timely examples, which is really important. So to those that have tuned in, you don't have to have it figured out, but know that you would be coming into a program that does provide you with lots of transferable skills. You're certainly not going to be pigeonholed in any way, and that you're able to do deep dives into to exploratory issues that are happening to us every day in the world. So I think that that's quite fascinating.
It is, and I see a wonderful comment from Tia, and she's talking about her son in grade 11. And our digital enterprise management program is so unique and so impressive. I have an MBA in information technology as well, but that's from not yesterday, maybe a few years ago. And in that program, it was very classic MBA where we talked about technology. Here in our program, we've gone a step further. And this makes us really different from like doing a Bachelor of Commerce or a BA in management. What we do is we actually integrate technologies right into every course. Every course, it's not just business. If you're doing economics, we talk about economics and technology and how those things are coming together. When we do finance, we talk about fintech. And fintech is an exploding area where we have every major bank coming in to talk to us about our students because they understand blockchain, not just from a concept, but actually how it works. We actually have an entire course dedicated to emerging technologies in the business sector. And so we really take on that challenge of looking at this new world that is so, especially now, right, focused on online technologies and media technologies and translating that for the business world. So if you're interested in business, for me, business and digital go together now, right? I used to be a consultant for Deloitte and IBM before I came back to academia. And a lot of what we do is around this idea of thinking about digital channels, digital marketing. We have 3 courses in digital marketing, for example, at ICCIT. So we are really locked into that concept. Thank you.
That's right. Any other questions that are coming in? If you do have a question, you can put it into the chat box on the side.
Then I see those directly. And then if not, then Marissa also has access. So just as I was talking in the presentation that I shared with you, the research, I talked about that Kano model. And I really am excited to show, and I'm always willing to demonstrate how the power of the University of Toronto is that we take the best researchers in the world and we put them in the classroom. And what that does is it gives me the chance to take something I would do in research like the Kano model, which looks at feature preferences on media, and show how I use it in research, but I teach it to my students. They can then take that into the workplace and use it in multiple ways. So our students come in knowing not just the sort of basic rudimentary things, but just think they reconceptualize the problem, right? What is the issue we're trying to solve for? And they bring a certain amount of amazing theoretical knowledge that isn't just boring theory sitting, dusty on a shelf, but is live theory that we are actually helping to create. And actually we make theory all the time at U of T, but it's not theory that sits on a shelf. It's theory that we use and we apply. So it's a very applied set of programs, and you have the opportunity to do our digital skills media. I don't know if Marissa, do you have another question, or can I talk about the digital?
No, keep going. Yeah.
Okay, good. So we have a new thing coming up. And that's our digital skills certificate. So it'll be a certificate of completion. So on top of your honors Bachelor of Arts that you would get as an ICCIT graduate, you would also be eligible, if you so choose, with no additional cost, to get a certificate of completion in media skills. And what those are, those could be Adobe. So you could be, getting yourself almost certified in Adobe. Project management would be another one that's been very, very, project management for information technology is very, very hot right now. And other kinds of skills, web development, for example, is something that we would offer. So these run alongside our courses. So you have your regular courses, and throughout your time with us at ICCIT, you can take 10 of these workshops, and they're smaller. They're like intense, they're online. Some of them, if they're like 3D printing, for example, is another one. That one would require later on getting back into a very safe and socially distanced lab experience to get some hands-on skills. But for sure, this is so that you can have on your CV, not just all the amazing honors Bachelor of Arts from University of Toronto, but you can also come out with this certificate of completion in technology skills that are very marketable. And that is something you could also put on your resume. So we're starting those, starting this winter. We are starting with a small group of workshop courses, and then we're going to run those workshops throughout the year from winter on. And it would be from your second year, once you are accepted into ICCIT, it's open to you and it's all part of your experience at ICCIT.
Excellent. I'm cognizant of time. I did want to take an opportunity to also share that there are lots of fantastic related student clubs, in addition to studying in the classroom. Really great clubs where you can also come together with students in the program and other areas to collaborate. And I wanted to share from an admissions perspective. I'm the director of undergraduate admissions. If you are thinking about CCIT, which I certainly hope that you are, because it is just a phenomenal program, really want you to spend time on your English this year. If you're in high school, we're going to be paying particular attention to your grade 12 for you English. Want to see really strong marks in that subject area, and then really looking at your top grade 12 U and M courses, minimum of 6. And I'm happy to chat with you further. We have a number of admission related sessions during the week.
So I'm just in the chat. Marissa.
Oh, you have more chats? I'm not seeing those. I'm so sorry.
No problem. I just got a question around, can the program be paired with business certificate? So,
great.
So I wanted to answer that. Our digital enterprise management program is a specialist, and that specialist program means that the students would spend most of their time with us. And so they're already getting a lot of the business know-how. So instead of a business certificate, we're doing this technical skills certificate to go alongside. So our DEM program, Digital Enterprise Management, you do the certificate of completion and get the technical skills alongside that. So those go together. You do have technical courses in DEM as well. But as I explained, they have to do with what are some of the programming elements, the smaller programming elements that are used in business, but not just programming. It's like systems, understanding information systems, understanding supply chain management, for example, and the technologies integrated in logistics, understanding CRM, customer relationship management, and how that works in a digital space, etc. So those are the things you would learn in DEM. And somebody's just put a link up there for you to DEM. So yeah, and the last thing I'll say, and before we run out of time, is that we have 2 amazing opportunities for work integrated learning. So people often ask me, Rhonda, do you have co-op? We certainly do. We don't call it co-op at U of T. We have the first, and in all of the University of Toronto, Mississauga, we were the first unit to put out our co-op offering, which is called a certificate again. So this certificate, though, is different. This one is a work integrated learning. You start in your second year with work preparation skills, and it's actually classes that you take. And then in your third and fourth year, you go out and take paid connections with the industry. So we actually find you a placement and you work, and that's all part of your certificate. So these are additional things that are, as I said, there's no additional charges. There's a CGPA requirement, so you need to you need to show us that you're able to handle working and going to school if you're interested. And if that route is too much, we also have our internship program, which is smaller. It's semester long, and you could be in either paid or unpaid internship. Some people want to work for not-for-profits, which are amazing places to work, like Doctors Without Borders. We have almost every year had a student intern with them. And so those are great places to get experience. And I see that Anu has put in for you into the chat, the Zoom chat, 2 links that you can find more information about that. So Marissa, we have 1 minute left. So
Excellent. No, I don't see any other questions in the side chat. I don't know if there are any further in the Zoom chat, but we will be posting this lecture afterwards up on our website. So if you wanted to go back and watch it again, perhaps with some friends or family, and we certainly want to keep the conversations going. So any opportunity that you wanted to reconnect with Rhonda, we're happy to facilitate those conversations, and really hope that this gave you the inside perspective that you are looking for CCIT. Anytime that I listen to any of Rhonda's conversations or lectures, I always wish this type of program had been available to me, because I certainly would have tried to get into it. I think it's so fascinating. Thank you so much.
We would welcome you as a student, Melissa. Don't worry.
Thank you. You'd have your work cut out for you, I guarantee you. Thank you so much for your time. I know that you are quite busy, and on behalf of all of the guests that tuned in this evening, thank you very much, and we look forward to connecting with you throughout the week. Have a lovely evening.
Thanks, everyone. Bye, everyone.
Take care.
Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Bye for now.